What would you do if the person sleeping next to you every night loved your money more than they loved you? Would you walk away quietly, or would you set a trap to expose the truth? Stephen did something most people wouldn't dare. He faked being broke to test his girlfriend's love, and what he discovered shattered everything he thought he knew about their relationship.
Fair African Tales. Subscribe and turn on the bell for new stories.
Stephen stood on the balcony of his penthouse in Victoria Island, Lagos, watching the city lights shimmer like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Behind him, through floor-to-ceiling windows, Kenny moved through their living space with the grace of someone who belonged in luxury. Designer heels clicked against Italian marble. Her laughter, light, musical, intoxicating, floated through the air as she spoke to someone on the phone, probably planning their next getaway. To anyone watching, they were the perfect couple. Young, beautiful, successful, untouchable. But perfection, Stephen had learned, is often just an expensive illusion. He'd built his empire from nothing. At 32, he owned 3 tech companies, real estate across West Africa, and investment portfolios that made financial advisors salivate. Money had come, but wisdom had come slower. And now, standing in the cool Lagos night, champagne glass in hand, Stephen felt something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. Not about his business, not about his intelligence, but about the woman he loved, or thought loved him. The distinction, he was beginning to realize, mattered more than he'd ever imagined. Kenny appeared beside him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. Her perfume, something French and expensive that he'd bought her last month, filled his senses. "Baby, what are you thinking about?" she whispered against his shoulder. Stephen smiled, but the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just enjoying the view," he said. She squeezed him tighter. "You work too hard. Come inside. I ordered from that Japanese place you love." He turned to face her. God, she was beautiful. Smooth, dark skin that seemed to glow in the ambient light. Eyes that sparkled with mischief and warmth. Lips that curved into a smile that had first caught his attention 2 years ago at a gallery opening in Ikoyi. "You're too good to me," he said, and he meant it, or wanted to mean it, or used to mean it. She kissed him softly. "That's because you're too good to me first." The words were right. The moment was right. Everything should have felt right. So why did it feel like standing on the edge of something crumbling? The crack had appeared 3 weeks ago. Small at first, barely noticeable. They'd been shopping at the Palms when Kenny spotted a handbag. Limited edition, recently arrived from Milan, the kind of accessory that announced wealth before you even opened your mouth. She'd held it like a newborn, eyes bright with desire. "Stephen, look at this. Isn't it gorgeous?" He'd glanced at the price tag. 2.5 million naira for a bag. He'd bought her 3 bags that month alone. "It's beautiful," he'd said carefully. "But didn't you just get that Birkin last week?" Her face had shifted, just slightly, just enough. "That's different. That's for formal events. This is casual." "Casual 2.5 million, he'd said with a smile, trying to keep it light. The smile she returned didn't reach her eyes either. "Forget it," she'd said, placing the bag back with exaggerated care. "I didn't realize we were counting now." She'd walked ahead of him through the mall, her silence louder than any argument. That evening, back at the penthouse, she'd been distant, distracted. Her kisses had felt obligatory, her laughter forced. He'd noticed. Stephen always noticed. The second crack came a week later. Dinner reservations at Noir, the kind of restaurant where meals cost more than most Lagosians made in a month. Kenny had spent the evening scrolling through her phone, occasionally showing him pictures. Chioma just got back from Dubai. Look at where David took her. Isn't it stunning? Stephen had looked. Overwater bungalows, crystal water, luxury he could afford 10 times over. It's nice, he'd said. Nice? Kenny had laughed, but there was an edge to it. Stephen, it's paradise. When was the last time we travelled? Really travelled? We went to Cape Town in January. That was for your conference. I mean a real vacation. Just us. Somewhere that makes people stop scrolling. He'd reached across the table for her hand. We can plan something. Maybe next month when things slow down. Things never slow down with you, she'd interrupted, pulling her hand back to lift her wineglass. There's always a meeting, always a deal, always something more important. The accusation hung between them like smoke. More important than her, she meant. More important than them. He'd tried to salvage the evening, but the damage was done. She'd picked at her food, responded to his attempts at conversation with monosyllables. And in the car ride home, she'd sat pressed against the passenger window, watching Lagos blur past, a continent away, despite sitting inches from him. Stephen wasn't stupid. He was observant, trained by years of business negotiations to read subtext, to notice what people didn't say, to catch the micro-expressions that revealed truth. And the truth he was seeing terrified him. Because when he bought her things, she glowed. When he said yes to her requests, she was affectionate. When money flowed freely, love flowed freely. But the moment he hesitated, the moment he questioned, the moment he suggested restraint, everything cooled, not dramatically, not obviously, just enough to notice, just enough to doubt. He'd tested his theory carefully. One week, he'd showered her with gifts, jewelry, clothes, surprise deliveries to her office. She'd been radiant, attentive, passionate. The next week, citing a fictional cash flow issue, he'd suggested they eat in more, maybe skip some of the expensive outings. She'd agreed verbally, but her body language told a different story. Distance, irritation, impatience. By week's end, she'd picked a fight over nothing and spent the night at her friend's place. He wanted to be wrong, so he'd confided in the one person who'd never lied to him. His sister, Rebecca. They'd met for lunch at a quiet spot in Lekki, away from the crowds, away from Kenny's social circle. Rebecca had listened to everything, her face growing more serious with each detail. When he finished, she'd sat back, arms crossed, expression unreadable. You already know the answer, Stephen, she'd finally said. You didn't call me to ask, you called me for permission to accept it. Maybe I'm overthinking, maybe I'm… You're not. Rebecca's voice was gentle but firm. I've been watching her for 2 years. I kept quiet because you seemed happy, and I wanted you to be happy. But Stephen, that woman doesn't love you. She loves what you provide. The words landed like blows. You don't know that. You can't. I can. I do. Because I've seen how she acts when you're not around. At your birthday party last year, when you were handling that business call, I watched her. She barely engaged with anyone who wasn't obviously wealthy. She collected connections like trading cards. And when your friend Michael, remember Michael the teacher, tried to talk to her about education reform, she literally looked through him until someone more important appeared. Stephen had wanted to argue, but memories flooded back. Small moments he'd dismissed. The way Kenny categorized people by their perceived worth. Her dismissiveness towards service staff, how she'd pressured him to cut ties with childhood friends who hadn't made it. Rebecca had leaned forward, her eyes searching his. I love you. You're brilliant, successful, kind. You deserve someone who sees that without the price tag attached, but right now you don't have that. You have someone playing a role, and the moment the pay stops, the show stops. So what do I do? Rebecca had smiled then, not unkindly. You already know. You're Stephen. You've built companies from ideas. You've turned nothing into empires. Apply that same strategic thinking here. You mean test her. I mean confirm what you already suspect, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. The word had resonated. Clarity. Because living in doubt was its own kind of prison, wasn't it? Not knowing, always wondering, constantly questioning if the woman beside him saw him or saw his bank account. That night, lying in bed with Kenny asleep beside him, Stephen had made his decision, not impulsively, not emotionally, but with the same calculated precision he brought to every major business move. He would test the foundation, and if it crumbled, better to know now than years down the line with children involved, with lives entangled beyond extraction. The plan took 2 weeks to construct. Rebecca helped, so did Marcus, his oldest friend and financial advisor. They would stage a collapse, make it public, make it believable, make it complete. Friends from the business community would pose as creditors. Marcus would leak stories to financial blogs about bad investments, leveraged positions gone wrong, catastrophic losses. They'd paint Stephen not as broke, but as drowning in debt. Companies folded, assets liquidated. The golden boy of Lagos Tech brought low by hubris and bad luck. It had to be dramatic. Half measures wouldn't work. If Kenny's love was conditional, they needed to remove all conditions. Strip everything away until only the man remained. Then they'd see what she truly valued. The execution began on a Wednesday. Stephen remembered because Kenny had planned brunch with friends that morning. He'd told her he needed to handle some urgent business matters, kissed her goodbye, and watched her leave looking stunning in an outfit he'd paid for, carrying a bag he'd gifted, wearing confidence he'd financed. By noon, the first articles appeared online. Tech mogul Stephen Adeyemi faces financial crisis. Companies collapse under debt. By evening, his phone was exploding. Concerned colleagues, curious competitors, vultures circling, and Kenny. She'd called 6 times before he answered. Stephen, what's happening? People are asking me questions. There are articles. They're saying, I know what they're saying, he'd interrupted, keeping his voice carefully calibrated between stressed and controlled. Where are you? We need to talk. They'd met at the penthouse. He'd rehearsed this moment, but seeing her face, genuine concern mixed with something else, something calculating, made his chest tighten. Tell me this is fake. Tell me this is competitors spreading rumours. He'd sat down heavily, playing the part. I wish I could. The investments I made last quarter, they were riskier than I admitted. I thought I could leverage them, multiply our returns. Instead, he'd let the sentence trail off, watching her process. How bad? Bad. The companies are being seized to cover debts. Creditors are coming for everything. The penthouse, the cars, the accounts. Kenny, I'm about to lose it all. The silence that followed felt infinite. He watched her face cycle through emotions, shock, disbelief, fear, and then something harder to define. Not quite anger, not quite disappointment, something colder. How long have you known? She'd finally asked. A few weeks. I kept thinking I could fix it, turn it around, but another calculated pause. I'm sorry, I never wanted this to touch you. She'd stood, pacing to the same balcony where he'd stood weeks ago, questioning everything. When she turned back, her face was composed. Too composed. What happens now? I find a way forward. I've survived worse. I'll rebuild. How long will that take? The question landed wrong, not how can I help or we'll get through this. Just how long? Stephen had shrugged. Years, maybe. I'll need to start from scratch. Find work to survive while I… Work? She'd laughed, but there was no humour in it. Stephen, you're a CEO. You own companies. You don't just work. Not anymore. Now I'm just a man who needs a job. The transformation happened faster than even Rebecca predicted. Within days, creditors, friends playing roles, showed up at the penthouse demanding payment. Kenny watched, horror-struck, as furniture was tagged, artwork was removed, luxury dissolved before her eyes. They'd moved to a modest apartment in Surulere, 2 bedrooms, basic amenities, the kind of place Stephen had lived in during his university days. Kenny had walked through it like someone touring a crime scene. "This is temporary, right?" she'd asked. "This is reality now," he'd replied. The first night there, she'd barely spoken. The second night, she'd cried. Not for him, he'd noticed, for the life that was gone. By the end of the first week, Stephen had taken a job. Security guard at one of his own companies, a manufacturing plant in IKEA he'd never physically visited. The manager, aware of the plan, had hired him without question. When Stephen came home that first evening in the navy blue uniform, carrying a lunchbox and looking authentically exhausted, Kenny had stared like he'd grown a second head. "You're serious about this? I'm serious about survival, about taking care of us." "Us," he'd said. But the look on her face suggested she was rethinking what us meant. When love is truly tested, when the gold is stripped away and only the person remains, what will you choose? The man or the money he once had? The uniform was just fabric and thread, but to Kenny, it became a symbol of everything she couldn't accept. Stephen's first shift as a security guard began at 6 in the morning. He woke in the small Surulere apartment to the sound of generators rumbling in the compound. Kenny lay beside him, her back turned, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional chasm growing between them. He dressed quietly in the navy blue uniform, fastening each button with hands that had once signed million-dollar contracts. The irony wasn't lost on him. This company, this very building he'd report to, existed because of decisions he'd made in boardrooms she'd never seen. But she didn't know that. She only knew what the uniform represented. Failure, poverty, embarrassment. When he emerged from the bedroom, Kenny was awake, sitting at their small dining table with a cup of coffee. Her eyes travelled from his boots to his badge, lingering on the security company logo stitched across his chest. She said nothing, but her face spoke volumes. Disgust, disappointment, something that looked dangerously close to contempt. "I'll be back by 6 this evening," Stephen said, keeping his voice neutral. "Okay," she replied. He waited, hoping for something more. A word of encouragement, a touch of affection, even acknowledgement of how hard he was trying. Instead, she turned away, scrolling through her phone, already mentally erasing him from her morning. Stephen left, closing the door softly behind him, wondering how long it would take before she stopped pretending to care at all. The job itself was easy. Stand at the gate, check identification, log visitors, smile politely. Pretend you haven't built this empire from nothing. The manager, Mr. Okonkwo, treated him with careful respect, aware of Paul the charade, but committed to the performance. The other guards, however, saw only what they were meant to see: a new guy, educated, clearly, but fallen on hard times. Lagos was full of stories like that: degrees that led nowhere, businesses that collapsed, pride swallowed in exchange for survival. They welcomed him with the casual camaraderie of men who understood struggle. During lunch break, they shared stories, laughed about difficult visitors, complained about pay. Stephen participated, asking questions, learning their names, genuinely interested in lives so different from the one he'd always known. It was humbling and strangely clarifying. These men found joy despite having so little. They supported families on salaries that wouldn't cover one of Kenny's handbags. They were rich in ways that had nothing to do with bank accounts. But would Kenny ever understand that? Or was her definition of wealth so narrow that anything outside luxury was worthless? He returned home that first evening to find Kenny dressed to go out. Makeup perfect, hairstyled, designer dress. The apartment smelled of her perfume. "You're going somewhere?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. "Dinner with Chioma and the girls. I told you last week." She hadn't. Or maybe she had, and he'd been too consumed with planning his fake downfall to remember. Either way, the message was clear. Life goes on. Her life, at least. "How was your day?" he asked, genuine curiosity mixing with his test. "Fine. Boring. How was yours?" The question came automatic, obligatory, as she checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. Different. "Met some good people. The work is simple, but—" "That's nice," she interrupted, not really listening. She grabbed her purse and left without kissing him goodbye. The shift happened gradually, then suddenly, like rust spreading across metal, slow until it's everywhere. Kenny started coming home later. Her explanations became vague. "Out with friends." "Networking event." "Just needed air." She stopped asking about his day entirely, stopped pretending interest in his work, stopped pretending much of anything. When he tried to initiate conversation, her responses were clipped. When he reached for her in bed, she was always too tired. The woman who once couldn't get enough of his touch now flinched when he brushed against her. 2 weeks into his security guard job, Stephen came home to find Kenny entertaining visitors. Chioma and another woman he didn't recognize, both dressed in outfits that cost more than his monthly guard salary. They looked up when he entered, their conversation stopping mid-sentence. "Ladies," he greeted, trying to ignore how out of place he felt in his own home. "Hi, Stephen," Chioma said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. The other woman just nodded, already looking away, dismissing him. He wasn't worth engaging anymore. Kenny stood abruptly. "I'll walk you out," she said to her friends, though they'd just arrived. Outside the apartment, he heard their voices, not the words, but the tone. Kenny's defensive, Chioma's pitying, the stranger's incredulous. When Kenny returned, her face was tight with anger. "You couldn't have changed before coming home," she snapped. "This is what I wear for work," Stephen replied calmly. "Yes, work, at a gate, while my friends are building careers, travelling, living actual lives." "And what am I doing, Kenny?" "Surviving, barely, and dragging me down with you." The words hung in the air, naked and brutal. So this was it, the truth finally spoken. He was an anchor now, a weight, something to be dragged rather than loved. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "Trying isn't enough." Her voice rose, frustration spilling over. "Do you know what they ask me? Do you know what I have to say when people want to know about my boyfriend, the man I'm with? What do you say?" "Nothing. I say nothing because what is there to say? That you guard a gate? That we live in Surulere, that I went from penthouses to this. She gestured at their modest living room as if it were a prison cell. Stephen watched her, studied her, catalogued every micro-expression. This was who she really was, not the woman who'd whispered promises in expensive restaurants. But here's what fascinated him. Here's what made him certain he was doing the right thing. Even now, even watching their relationship crumble in real time, part of him still hoped, still wanted her to prove him wrong, to shock him with sudden depth, to reveal that beneath the materialism was something real. Because if she didn't, if she failed this test completely, what did that say about his judgment? About the 2 years they'd spent together? About every moment he'd believed was genuine? Were any of them real? Or had he been in love with a performance the entire time? The breaking point came during a night out with mutual friends. Stephen had been reluctant to go, knowing how the evening would unfold. But Kenny insisted in that way that wasn't really about wanting him there, but about maintaining appearances. They met at a lounge in Victoria Island, the kind of place they used to frequent when his wallet matched the venue. Now, arriving in a taxi instead of his Mercedes, wearing clothes that were clean but clearly not designer, Stephen felt the shift in how people looked at him. Pity, curiosity, some poorly hidden satisfaction. Marcus was there, playing his role as concerned friend. "Stephen, man, how are you holding up?" "Day by day," Stephen replied, sticking to the script. Others chimed in with condolences that barely masked their judgment. Failed businesses were cautionary tales in Lagos, proof that even the successful could fall, proof that maybe they'd never been that successful to begin with. Kenny stood beside him. Smile fixed, body language screaming discomfort. When someone asked what Stephen was doing now, she changed the subject. When another person brought up old times, memories of when Stephen was flying high, she excused herself to the restroom. Travis was there. Successful, flashy Travis with his cryptocurrency money and his constant need to remind everyone how well he was doing. He approached Stephen with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard about your troubles, boss. Tough break." "Life happens," Stephen said evenly. "True, true. But you know what they say. You can tell a man's character by how he handles failure." Travis let the words land, then turned to Kenny, who'd returned from the restroom. "Kenny, you're looking stunning as always. That dress is fire." She smiled, actually smiled, in a way she hadn't smiled at Stephen in weeks. "Thank you, it's new." "Must be nice having something new in all this chaos," Travis said, and the implication was clear. How was she affording new things? Who was buying them? Kenny's laugh was too loud, too bright. "A girl has to maintain standards." "Indeed," Travis agreed, his eyes lingering just a second too long. "Some things shouldn't change just because circumstances do." Stephen watched the exchange, watched Kenny preen under Travis's attention, watched her gravitate toward wealth like a moth to flame. And he knew that even if he revealed the truth right now, even if he proved this was all a test, the damage was done. Because this was who she was, not because of the test, but revealed by it. Later that night, in the taxi home, Kenny was silent until she couldn't contain it anymore. "Do you know how humiliating that was?" "What exactly was humiliating?" Stephen asked. "Everything. You, standing there in your cheap shirt while everyone else is thriving. Travis asked what you're doing now. What was I supposed to say? My boyfriend is a security guard." "Is the job the problem, Kenny, or the fact that it's mine?" She turned to him, eyes blazing. "Both. I'm 28 years old, Stephen. I should be posting pictures from exotic locations, not making excuses for why my boyfriend can't afford dinner. We had dinner. I paid. With what? Your gate money. The contempt in her voice was acid. I used to date a billionaire. Now I'm with someone who counts coins to buy rice. Here's where Stephen made his choice. He could have ended the test right there, could have revealed the truth, proved his point, and salvaged whatever remained. But he didn't. Because he needed to see how far she'd go, needed to know if there was a bottom to her shallowness or if it was bottomless. I'm the same person, Kenny, the same man you claimed to love. No, she said quietly, you're not. That man had confidence, had presence, had a future. You're just trying to survive, and it's pathetic. The word hit like a slap. Pathetic. Was that what love became when money left? Pathetic. They rode the rest of the way in silence. Stephen stared out the window at Lagos at night. Neon lights reflecting off puddles, street vendors still hustling, life continuing regardless of anyone's personal drama. How many of these people, he wondered, were more honest in their poverty than Kenny had ever been in wealth? The final weeks were a study in deterioration. Kenny stopped hiding her disdain. She criticized his clothes, his smell after long shifts in the Lagos heat, his inability to take her anywhere nice. She compared him openly to other men. Marcus just bought Temi a car. Travis took his girlfriend to Seychelles. Even Michael, remember boring Michael? He at least has a real job. Stephen absorbed it all. Every comparison, every complaint, every casual cruelty. He watched the woman he'd loved reveal herself as someone he'd never really known. Or had he known and chosen not to see? That question haunted him more than her insults. One evening, coming home after a particularly long shift, Stephen found Kenny on the phone, her voice low but urgent. She didn't hear him enter. I can't keep doing this. You don't understand what it's like living with someone who has nothing. No, he's trying. But trying doesn't pay bills. I don't know yet. I just need to figure out my options. She turned and saw him. Guilt flashed across her face before hardening into defiance. I have to go, she said into the phone, hanging up. Who was that? Stephen asked. A friend. None of your business. It's my business if you're making exit plans. She laughed bitterly. Exit plans? Stephen, I'm living in an exit. Every day here is temporary. You know it. I know it. The only question is how long I pretend otherwise. The honesty was almost refreshing. Almost. So that's it. The moment things got hard, you're done. Hard? Her voice rose. Stephen, hard is working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Hard is struggling but building towards something. This isn't hard. This is hopeless. You're a security guard with no prospects, no plan, nothing but promises that you'll somehow, someday, maybe rebuild. I didn't sign up for maybe. What did you sign up for? A life, a real life, trips, nice dinners, a man who can provide, who can buy you, Stephen interrupted. That's what you mean, a man who can afford you. Don't twist this into me being shallow. This is about standards, about refusing to settle. You're right, Stephen said, and his calmness seemed to unnerve her. You should have standards, and I should have seen yours sooner. They stood facing each other in the small apartment, 2 people occupying the same space but inhabiting completely different realities. Stephen saw the end, saw it clearly. This was the cliff they'd been approaching since the first crack appeared, since the first time her smile had depended on his spending. Since the first moment love became conditional, but he had to see it through, had to let her make the final choice, because maybe, just maybe, she'd surprise him. Maybe when faced with actually walking away, she'd hesitate, reconsider, choose the man over the money. It was foolish hope. He knew it even as he felt it. But hope, he was learning, was sometimes the last thing to die, even when everything else was already gone. Can love survive when everything comfortable is stripped away? Or does affection need luxury to breathe? What happens when you build a relationship on gold and the gold turns to dust? The answer was coming. Stephen could feel it. Like a storm you sense before seeing, like thunder before lightning. Kenny was preparing her exit. The only question remaining was how she'd justify it to herself. How she'd frame abandoning him as somehow his fault, because people rarely admit they're leaving for money. They dress it up in other words: compatibility, different life goals, growing apart. But Stephen would hear the truth beneath the words. He always did. The question wasn't what she'd say. The question was whether anything she said would matter anymore. When someone shows you who they are, do you give them one more chance to prove you wrong, or do you finally believe them? The final conversation happened on a Thursday evening. She'd been waiting, preparing, rehearsing whatever speech she'd constructed to make leaving him feel righteous instead of ruthless. "We need to talk," she said, and those 4 words carried the weight of an ending. Stephen sat across from her, still in his uniform. "I can't do this anymore. Stephen?" Her voice was steady, controlled, like she'd practiced this. "I've tried. God knows I've tried. But this life, this situation, it's not what I signed up for." "What did you sign up for, Kenny?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, searching for words that would make her sound less shallow than she felt. Partnership. Support. A future that's moving forward, not standing still. "We're not standing still. I'm working. I'm trying to rebuild as a security guard." The words burst out, her careful composure cracking. "Stephen, I'm 28 years old. My friends are getting engaged to men with careers, with prospects. I can't keep explaining why my boyfriend guards gates for a living." There it was, the truth dressed in justification. She wasn't leaving because he'd changed. She was leaving because his bank account had. Stephen felt something inside him settle. Not peace exactly, but clarity. The test was complete. The results were conclusive. "So this is about money," he said. "It's about stability. It's about having a partner who can provide, who can take care of me. Who can afford you?" Stephen interrupted gently. "Let's call it what it is, Kenny. You're not leaving because I changed. You're leaving because the lifestyle changed." Her face flushed with anger or shame. He couldn't tell which. "You don't get to judge me. You don't get to act like wanting financial security makes me shallow. I deserve better than this." "You're right," Stephen said, and his agreement seemed to catch her off guard. "You deserve exactly what you value most, and clearly that's not me." Silence filled the space between them. Kenny looked away, blinking rapidly. Were those tears? Genuine emotion? Or just the performance's final act? "I didn't want it to end like this," she said softly. "How did you want it to end?" She didn't answer. Couldn't, probably, because there was no good answer. No way to walk away from someone struggling without revealing exactly who you were beneath the surface. "I'll pack my things tomorrow," she finally said. "You can keep the apartment. I'm going to stay with Chioma until I figure things out." Figure things out. Find the next man with money, she meant. The next provider, the next wallet to replace the one that had emptied. Stephen nodded. "Before you go," he said, standing, moving closer, "I want you to know something." She looked up at him, waiting. "I loved you, Kenny, really loved you. Not because you were beautiful, though you are. Not because you fit into my life perfectly, though you did. I loved you because I thought underneath everything you saw me, the actual me, the person, not the portfolio. Her eyes glistened, but she said nothing. I was wrong, Stephen continued. You never saw me. You saw what I could provide, and the moment I couldn't provide it anymore, I became invisible. Then I became pathetic. Then I became something to escape from. Stephen, no, let me finish. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. I don't hate you for this. I'm not even angry anymore. I'm just sad. Sad that you'll spend your whole life chasing comfort instead of connection. Sad that you'll never know what it feels like to be loved for who you are instead of what you have. And sad that I wasted 2 years loving someone who was never really there. A tear rolled down Kenny's cheek. I did love you, she whispered. Maybe you did, Stephen replied, but not enough, not when it mattered, not when love required sacrifice instead of luxury. She stood then, grabbed her purse, moved toward the door. This was it, the moment of departure, the final test. Would she turn around? Would doubt creep in? Would she see something in his eyes, his posture, his calmness that made her question her choice? She paused at the door, hand on the handle. Stephen's heart beat faster despite himself. Say something, he thought. Choose differently. Prove me wrong. I'm sorry it ended like this, Kenny said without turning around. Then she opened the door and walked out. The sound of it closing echoed in the small apartment. Final. Definitive. Complete. Stephen stood alone in his security guard uniform in the modest apartment he'd chosen as a stage for this test, and felt the full weight of confirmation. She'd failed, or he'd failed, or they'd both failed together. But the test was over. The truth was revealed. Love, it turned out, had always been conditional, and the condition had always been money. He sat down slowly, exhaustion washing over him. Not physical tiredness from his shift, but the bone-deep weariness that comes from having your worst suspicions confirmed. Rebecca had been right. Kenny had never loved him. She'd loved the life he provided, and the moment that life disappeared, so did she. Outside, Lagos hummed with its usual chaos. Traffic, generators, distant music, life continuing regardless of individual heartbreak. Somewhere out there, Kenny was already rewriting their story, already justifying her exit, already looking toward the next chapter that didn't include a broke security guard. And Stephen? He remained still, processing, cataloguing, learning. This was the cost of clarity. This hollow feeling, this validated suspicion, this painful proof that he'd been right to doubt. But being right didn't feel like victory. It just felt like loss. So here's my question for you. Do you think Stephen was wrong to have made this kind of move? If you were in his shoes, what would you have done? Is it right to end a relationship when the benefits stop? What would you have done differently? If you suspected someone loved your money more than they loved you, would you test them? Would you risk losing them to gain the truth? Or would you rather live in comfortable uncertainty than painful clarity? Drop your answer in the comments below because this story isn't over. What happens when Kenny discovers the reality? What happens when the broke security guard reveals he's actually the billionaire who orchestrated everything? We will soon find out, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Hit that subscribe button right now, turn on notifications, because the truth is about to come out, and the consequences will change everything. See you in the next one.